So we'll get started. So welcome to the SADS Foundation's Living with SADS webinar series. Today's webinar is entitled Everything You Ever Wanted to Know About Clinical Trials. Thank you for joining us tonight for Dr. Landstrom's presentation and our live Q&A, where you may ask your questions about clinical trials. I'm Marcia Baker, the Program Director for the SADS Foundation. Dr. Landstrom is an Associate Professor of Pediatrics at Duke University's School of Medicine. He's a physician scientist and cross-trained in pediatric cardiology, electrophysiology, human genetics, and molecular physiology. He directs an active research program at Duke University that brings together clinical medicine, functional genomics, precision medicine, and molecular and cellular biology. Dr. Landstrom is also a member of the SADS Foundation's Board of Trustees. Many of you know that he worked with Dr. Mike Ackerman at Mayo Clinic when he first started. We're honored that Andrew volunteers his expertise and time so generously for the SADS Foundation. After his presentation, you may ask your questions about clinical trials. You may post those questions in the chat, and we'll address them at the end of his presentation. So welcome, Dr. Landstrom. I'll turn the program over to you.
Well, thank you, Marcia, and good afternoon and good evening to everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for taking time out of your day to learn a little bit more about clinical trials. And obviously, we're at a very important time for individuals with SADS conditions because we're at this inflection point, meaning the number of therapies that are coming down the pike are increasing very quickly. There's a lot of promise for new therapies, and so a talk about clinical trials, which is the process by which these new therapies are proven to work, is a very timely conversation. I have no disclosures or conflicts of interest or relationships with industry. I do accept salary support and research funding for a number of not-for-profit organizations, and everything that I'm going to share with you in this talk is available in the public domain. So over the next 30 minutes or so, this is the outline of what we're going to cover. We're going to talk about what are clinical trials. We're going to talk about the phases of a clinical trial, which I think are very much germane to a lot of the SADS conditions, because there's some great therapies coming down the pike for those conditions, and they're early in their trials. We'll talk about how trials work. We'll talk about enrollment and participation, FDA process funding, and then long-term expectations of what you might think about before joining a trial. We're going to do this through sort of a generic overview of clinical trials, and then we're going to take some time to discuss very specific, ongoing, early phase clinical trials specifically for SADS conditions. I'll offer some questions that you might keep front of mind if you're thinking about a clinical trial, and then I'll close by sharing with some resources. So briefly, an overview of what clinical trials are. So what are clinical trials? Clinical trials are essentially ways in which volunteers volunteer to have a new therapy, drug, or medical device tested on them. Participation, as you might imagine, for these types of things is always voluntary. And universally, anybody who volunteers has the option to leave the trial at any time. The overall goal of these clinical trials is to determine whether a new treatment, no matter what that treatment is, works perhaps better than the current existing options for therapy, and perhaps most importantly, is safe. Clinical trials are typically started by a company, although not always. And typically that company has a vested interest in this trial because they want to bring that drug to market. Thus, if a clinical trial is funded by a company, there is an inherent conflict of interest because they have a financial incentive to see that trial come to fruition. With that being said, there are steps that are put in place to make sure the clinical trial is rigorous, meaning you can trust the results. A detailed study protocol is always drafted in advance to make sure that everyone's on board with how the study will be conducted. And this includes things like how long the study will be going, what the objectives of the study will be, the types of individuals, patients, volunteers that will be recruited for the study. And for this, we'll talk about eligibility criteria, meaning What do you have to be one of these individuals? There's oftentimes a very detailed protocol for the types of drugs or therapies that will be tested, the dosages that will be used, and then a very clear schedule for the tests and procedures that will happen for anybody who volunteers for this trial. A helpful resource, which we'll mention again at the end, for all of this is clinicaltrials.gov, which is a free open access website that you can go to right now and read all about all the ongoing clinical trials, who funds them, and get a sense of what this study protocol looks like for all of these trials. And I really recommend it as a resource, a first stop if you're thinking about joining the clinical trial. What are the phases of a clinical trial? Well, there are many different phases, and they progress from sort of what I think of as being research-based, like the lab, all the way through to big clinical trials at the end to show that a study works. You may hear the term preclinical trial, which is sort of like the bench science, the wet lab science, that generates the concept of what might be potentially a new therapy, what might be potentially a new drug, all that sort of done in the lab. We call that preclinical. And there's a transition from a new therapy that looks like it's working in the lab to something that we want to try in humans. And that's a transition from the preclinical to a clinical phase. The clinical trial phase is generally, but not always, about 3 phases or so. The first phase is usually the phase with the smallest number of volunteers, oftentimes 6 to 10 individuals, and it's just a first test to see how safe the drug is and to see how the drug is metabolized or circulates inside humans. We call it a phase 1 trial. Thus, if a trial is looking in phase 1, they're not necessarily asking, does it work? They're asking, is it safe? If it does appear to be safe in a small number of people, it may go on to a phase 2 clinical trial, which generally has more people, 20 to 50 oftentimes. And this is a bigger evaluation for safety. And you start to get a sense of what's called efficacy, or the question of does the drug, does the new therapy actually work for the disease in question? If it looks safe and there's signs of efficacy, it may move forward to a phase 3 clinical trial, which is much bigger, usually 100 to 200 individuals. And this is where they want to show that it actually has a benefit to treating the disease, perhaps above and beyond what the standard therapy is. And the entire time, they're also looking very carefully for safety. And then typically after phase 3, if everything looks good and the FDA approves, it becomes a new drug that doesn't end the sort of phases of a trial. It just shifts to what we call post-market surveillance, basically meaning now the drug is available for people to use, but they continue to watch for safety and side effects even after the drug's been approved by the FDA. Sometimes we refer to that as a phase 4 trial. So what about a phase 1 trial? Well, phase 1 trials, I think of, are individuals who want to be explorers. This is the first time often the drug has ever been put into people. And so the real focus is on safety. Oftentimes, these individuals who are volunteering for phase 1 trials are doing so out of a sense of altruism. They know that by volunteering, that they're offering themselves up for science to move this drug forward. They may never see benefit, and they might see harm. And so they're really explorers. They're really sort of doing this for the sake of moving the field forward. And so if you're thinking of taking part in particularly an early phase clinical trial, ask yourself, am I more of an explorer or not? Am I doing this for others and potentially what might happen down the road or not? That's going to weigh very heavily in a phase 1 trial. As I mentioned, phase 1 trials are small numbers of individuals. I think of them as explorers, usually less than a dozen individuals. And they get this drug for the first time. Oftentimes the first time ever it's been given to a human. There may be different doses of the drug based on predictive studies, but oftentimes the dose of the drug changes. The initial look, the most important things looked at in these phase 1 trials are safety. And so they're looking for unintended or harmful effects in those first volunteers. As you can imagine, because this is the focus, there is intense clinical monitoring, typically in a hospital setting. They don't want you going anywhere, but they want you where they can monitor you. And oftentimes there is a suite of blood tests and other clinical tests to see how your body handles the medication, what happens to it, and to make sure that you're safe during this process. One of the things they're looking for is how your body changes the drug, whether it metabolizes the drug, whether it excretes the drug, how long it stays in circulation in your system. So there's lots of tests to look for that. Oftentimes that means blood draws or urine tests. They may also try to get a sense of how the drug affects your body. We call this pharmacodynamics. How the drug circulates, called pharmacokinetics. How the drug acts on you is pharmacodynamics. And they may look to see if there are signs that the drug is having its pharmacodynamic predicted effect. But again, that's not really the focus of the phase 1 trial. The focus of the phase 1 trial is mainly safety. Said another way, this is kind of what they're looking for. They're looking for how drugs are absorbed, metabolized, distributed in your circulation, and then excreted. For therapies that are taken repeatedly, they may be looking at blood tests or other tests to determine how the blood builds or how the therapy builds up in the blood with repeated dosing. If taken by mouth, how effectively does it get into the blood? Is enough of it being absorbed from the stomach? Is enough of it getting it into your circulation? That's a main focus of phase 1 trials. For a one-time therapy, a give it once kind of a drug, they're asking how well does it get into your system? How high does a level get in your system? And then how long does it take for that level to clear? And what happens after it's cleared? So there's some very fundamental questions about how that drug behaves in people, pharmacokinetics, that are the focus of phase 1 trials. Phase 2 trials, as I mentioned, are somewhat larger, 20 to 50 individuals. These individuals are still considered explorers because the major focus of this is safety still, but safety in more individuals. There's still intense monitoring, again, typically in a hospital setting, and oftentimes blood tests and other clinical tests to make sure you're safe. There's a little bit more evaluation as to whether the drug is having its intended effect, its pharmacodynamic benefit. And sometimes phase 1 and phase 2 clinical trials are kind of jointly done together to kind of speed the process up. As I mentioned, phase 3 trials have far more individuals, 1 to 200 people. Oftentimes, this is where you're looking to see whether the drug has its intended effect, or maybe even whether it has an effect that's greater than whatever the existing therapy might be. For individuals in this arm, they may be given a placebo, meaning like a sugar pill or something that has no actual effect on the body, but looks identical to the actual drug, to really be rigorous and quantitative as to what the effects of the drug may be. You may not know, as a subject of a phase 3 trial that has a placebo arm, whether you're taking a placebo or not. In fact, the people doing the study may not even know whether you're taking a placebo or not. We call that blinding, and that blinding is really important so that whatever effects are there, they're not being swayed by one's perspective. Right? Also, in phase 3, they're also looking for safety because you've got a larger number of people, and so you might start to see the rarer side effects show up in phase 3 trials. The Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, monitors patient safety throughout the trial. Throughout each of the phases, the data as it's being acquired is analyzed very thoroughly to make sure there are no safety concerns. Sometimes, if safety concerns develop, the FDA and the scientists can actually step in and end the trial early because of those safety concerns. However, if things go well and the phase 3 clinical trial it looks like it's working, they may approve it. But if at any point in time in the phase 3 trial it looks like the drug isn't going to be working, they can also end it early. We call that futility. The drug is not going to show its intended effect. So the FDA is really an active partner here to protect the safety of the participants. Say a drug makes it all the way through phase 3 clinical trials. After that phase 3, the FDA reviews all the results again, and they review it before they approve it going out into the marketplace to be a new therapy on the market. This ensures safety. It also ensures that the drug actually works, that it actually does its job. Sometimes the FDA can actually convene special advisory groups. These are independent experts who didn't have anything to do with the study, are not part of the FDA, and their job is to help advise the FDA to make a wise decision. And you can see here, these are just pictures of some of these FDA advisory groups that are convened to help review safety and efficacy of new drugs. And those phase 4, that sort of after the FDA has approved a drug and now it gets released into the market, that phase 4 is really post-market surveillance. They're watching the drug for safety now that people are taking it out in the general sort of marketplace. And this is really important for finding small, rare issues that happen with the drug. Rare side effects are really the thing they're looking for in phase 4 trials. It's important to realize that even though the FDA approves a drug after a phase 3 clinical trial, it may be only available in certain locations and the cost may be quite high. As you can imagine, it's very expensive to run a clinical trial. So oftentimes when it hits the marketplace, the company that made the drug, that sponsored the trial, is trying to recoup some of that cost. And so you will see potentially drugs being very expensive when they first hit the market. And as in all things, insurance may or may not cover it, especially early on, right after clinical trials. So switching gears a little bit from the mechanics of a clinical trial to who can participate, as you can imagine, trials are very specifically designed to test for safety and efficacy of a drug. And so the individuals who volunteer for that study must meet very specific criteria. We call these eligibility criteria. And they're very specific. Oftentimes the age of the individual matters, the medical history matters, so what are the other medical conditions of that individual, plus the current medical condition, the one that's being potentially studied in the face of this drug. Whether that individual is on or has taken previous medications is really important. And not everybody who might meet eligibility criteria will be accepted into the trial. They want to select individuals very carefully to make sure that they get the most bang for their buck and that the most people are safe and that the drug has the highest chance of showing efficacy. And it's important to remember, even if you're accepted into a trial, trials can end very quickly. Like I said, especially if there's a safety concern, it can just sort of end or be derailed. Informed consent is tremendously important. If you're thinking about a clinical trial, you should know exactly what the risks, what the potential benefits are, and that your participation is voluntary. And so informed consent is critical. Informed consent will be obtained from you in writing, just to show that you understand what these risks and benefits are. This is your time to make sure you have all your questions answered and you're going into it knowing exactly what the goals of the study are. It ensures that you can be, one, an active participant, but also ensures that you have rights as an individual to kind of take part in the study voluntarily and to know what's happening. Very important. As I mentioned previously, once you're enrolled, the clinical trial will follow its established protocol. And these are strict rules or guidelines that govern how the trial can operate. And you must follow, and the trial must follow, the predetermined tests, schedules, treatments, doctor visits, all of those things. Everyone has to be on board with kind of going through with it from start to finish. As I mentioned earlier, but it bears kind of expanding a bit more, clinical trials are very expensive, as you might imagine. They can cost millions of dollars at each phase of the trial. And this is one of the reasons why those drugs, when they reach the market, can be quite expensive. As I mentioned, they can be funded by pharmaceutical companies, who are oftentimes principal drivers of trials, but they can also be funded by government agencies or even not-for-profit organizations. Volunteers usually don't pay anything. However, insurance may be involved in routine care costs that are associated with it, just to be aware of. Now, what are longer-term expectations for individuals who might participate in a trial? Well, just know that they want to know that you're safe and that the drug is doing its job for quite a while after the study. And so there may be long periods of time where they're monitoring you for safety. They may be collecting long-term data about you. to make sure that they're fully informed about what the drug is doing. And because of this, some trials have follow-up periods that last years. So just be aware of that. So now that we've sort of covered the nuts and bolts of clinical trials, what are some ongoing trials for SADS conditions? And for now, I'll just focus on ongoing gene therapy trials, which are really quite exciting. And for this, it's really important to focus on one specific disease, which might be familiar to some of you, and that's arrhythmic cardiomyopathy, which actually, among all the SADS conditions, has the most treatments that are in early phase clinical trials. Arrhythmic cardiomyopathy, for those of you who may not know, is a heart muscle condition where the heart muscle turns to fat and scar. And it's a genetic disease, meaning a misspelling in a gene can cause that disease to develop. The genes that are responsible for arrhythmic cardiomyopathy make proteins that make this. This is a zoomed in cell of two heart cells that are stuck together. And in between those two heart cells, you can see sort of this black looking snake thing that's running from top to bottom. This is the cardiac desmosome, which is sort of like a rivet that links the two heart cells together. And this rivet allows for the heart to beat. Because on either side, you can see all these lines. Those are the actual myofilaments within the heart. And you can see how they're all sort of aligned perpendicularly to the desmosome. And so when they contract, they pull on each other. They transmit force across the cells, across that rivet, and allow all the cardiac myocytes to work together to squeeze your heart for every heartbeat. So you can imagine how if you have a genetic variant in the gene that makes up these desmosomes might actually pull apart a little bit, and you might have heart muscle disease because of it. And that's the basis of arrhythmic cardiomyopathy. Zooming in a little bit more as to what those molecules are, there's lots of different molecules that make up that rivet. This is a cartoon of many of the key molecules that make up that desmosome. One molecule, excuse me. One molecule I'll draw your attention to is PKP2 or plakophilin 2. Plakophilin 2 is responsible for holding together the inside of that cardiac desmosome. In patients who have mutations in genes for arrhythmic cardiomyopathy, will most likely have a mutation in PKP2 over any other gene. It's the most common gene mutated in arrhythmic cardiomyopathy. And so there are ongoing clinical trials designed around the fact that these mutations tend to cause the protein to be decreased in a normal heart cell. And so if one can deliver a replacement gene that replaces that PKP2 to normal levels in the heart cell, the hope is that that will actually fix the desmosome, fix the heart cell. It might halt the progression of arrhythmic cardiomyopathy. And there was some wonderful preclinical work that was done in heart cells and in mice that showed that replacement of PKP2 could actually potentially be a therapy. And so now there are 3 phase 1 clinical trials testing the hypothesis in people. This is one of them. It's the RIDGE-1 trial by Tenaya Therapeutics. It's a phase 1 trial, meaning it's very early. They're looking for a small number of individuals to basically test safety. To be eligible for enrollment, you need to have arrhythmic cardiomyopathy with a disease-associated variant in PKP2. You have to be an adult and under 65 years of age or younger. You have to be fairly advanced in terms of your arrhythmic cardiomyopathy and have in place an ICD, a shock box because of the risk of arrhythmias. We talked a little bit about previous treatments really matter for trials. So if, for example, you have had an ablation to ablate arrhythmias in the bottom chambers like ventricular tachycardia, that will actually exclude you from participating in this specific trial. You have to have frequent PVCs, misbeats of the heart, and you have to have low level of antibodies against something called AAV. AAV is adeno-associated virus, and low levels of AAV antibodies means that your immune system has not been exposed to AAV in the past. And that's really important because this gene therapy uses AAV to insert the normal PKP2 into your heart cells. And so you can imagine how if you have an immune response, all those white blood cells that are targeting AAV, you can potentially get very sick from this. And so you can't have signs of a previous AAV infection. This RIDGE-1 trial has a number of centers across the US where it's enrolling individuals, including places like San Francisco, Aurora, Colorado, Baltimore, Boston, Rochester, Minnesota, New York, and Cleveland. This is a second company that has a similar gene therapy for individuals with arrhythmic cardiomyopathy. This is the RPA 601 trial from Rocket Pharma. Like the previous trial, this is a phase 1 clinical trial, and you'll notice they're looking for individuals who are quite similar in many ways to individuals from the previous trial. You have to have arrhythmic cardiomyopathy, you have to have a PKP2 variant, you have to be an adult, have an ICD, have frequent misbeats from the volume chambers of the heart, PVCs, low levels of AAV antibodies, and you have to have good right heart squeeze. You can't have right ventricular dysfunction to participate in the trial. Rocket Pharma has 3 sites where it's enrolling from: UC San Diego, Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, and Duke. And the third company that has a clinical trial, also for arrhythmic cardiomyopathy, also for PKP2, is Lexeo Therapeutics, their LX2020 trial. Like before, they're looking for individuals who have a PKP2 variant and arrhythmic cardiomyopathy. They're looking for adults, 18 years or older, have an ICD in place, frequent PVCs, no right ventricular dysfunction, good heart squeeze, and then low levels of the circulating antibodies for a phase 1-2 combo clinical trial. So if you're thinking about a clinical trial, what questions might you want to consider? And these are just sort of questions that I think might be important, but certainly as you learn more, feel free to ask your own questions. These are just sort of to get you started. I'll start by asking, do I have the right condition? Right, I've just shown you 3 trials for arrhythmic cardiomyopathy. If you have another SADS condition that's not that, then you may not be eligible for these clinical trials. What if I have the right condition? The other question to ask is, do I know my genotype? So if I have arrhythmic cardiomyopathy, do I know that I have a PKP2 mutation that's the cause of my arrhythmic cardiomyopathy? And do I have that right genotype that corresponds to the needs of the clinical trial? Can I work with my SADS expert physician to provide needed records? They're going to want some validation that you actually have the disease that you think you do. You've got the right genotype and don't have any of the concerns that might exclude you. So you're going to have to work with your SADS physician to be able to move those records and to judge eligibility. I'd ask what the science is behind the new compound. I would personally want to know as much as I can about what that new experimental therapy is, the rationale behind it, and the potential risks. Has the preclinical data, meaning the science that went into the clinical trial, has that been published? And can I see the articles? And what's known about the safety of the approach? What's known about, for example, safety in terms of AAV delivery for gene therapy? Who's paying for the study? Who's the sponsor? Is it biotech, pharmaceutical company, government? What are my obligations for trial participation? For example, what do I need to do for doctor visits, lab testing? How long do I have to do it for? Where do I have to go? And then ask yourself internally, can I commit to all of that? If you're thinking, yeah, I can, that's much different than, gosh, I don't know if I can take the time to be able to do this. And then what happens after the trial concludes? Might the trial go on longer? These kinds of questions you can ask the sponsor. How might this new agent help me, potentially? Now remember, if you're in an early phase clinical trial, the issue is safety, right? So you may not know if it's going to help you or not. What costs are covered? Will my insurance need to pay for anything? And if so, what? Are all really important financial questions to ask. What can you ask your SADS expert physician? Am I eligible for these studies? They should have all that information and can talk you through it. What are the potential benefits and risks for me? Will this treatment be better than my current one? What are the potential side effects? And will I still receive my usual medical care during the trial and maybe after? How might this impact the therapeutic relationship you have with your SADS expert physician? These are all important questions to ask. And so to kind of close out our discussion, here are a few resources you might want to consider. This is that clinicaltrials.gov website. It has an up-to-date list of all the clinical trials, certainly in the US. And it's a kind of a global database, not just US clinical trials, but many non-US trials are listed here too. And this is a wonderful resource for you. You can go online, you can enter your SADS condition and see all the trials that are currently underway, and even some of the ones that are closed. There's also information under the National Institutes of Health about clinical trials more generally. And so you can go here to clinicaltrials.gov and see resources for patients and families as a good jumping off point if you're thinking about a clinical trial. These are great resources. Another resource is the American Society for Gene and Cell Therapy, which is an organization for scientists and people who are in this space. They're called ASGCT for short. They have a wonderful website with great resources for individuals, specifically for gene and cell therapy trials. And they have this newsletter called the Patient Press, which is a patient-focused newsletter that comes out about once a month or so to stay up to date on news and events in the sort of gene and cell therapy space. It's not just SADS conditions, but it's a great resource to kind of hear about all the great things that are happening in gene and cell therapy more broadly. I'd love to just highlight the tremendous resources that the SADS Foundation has in this space. They have wonderful, wonderful, wonderful resources for patients and families about SADS conditions, including what to consider for all the clinical trials that are coming down the pipe. And so I highly recommend SADS as a resource for you all too, if you're looking for a trusted place to learn more. And so my take-home points before we get to our questions and answers. Clinical trials help develop new treatments and improve medical knowledge. Trials follow a strict safety protocol with lots of regulatory oversight, with the focus being your safety. Participants should ask key questions before joining. Risks and benefits must be carefully considered by you before joining. And participation is voluntary and contributes to medical advances. And so I didn't show you any research here, but these are the folks that are part of my research team, as well as my clinical team here at Duke. You might also in the background hear my 2-year-old Cavapoo puppy, who's part of our home team here, who's making her dissatisfaction known that our neighbors are probably walking a dog by us. With all of this, I would love to answer any questions you may have. Thank you all for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Landstrom. And I posted in the chat, we welcome your questions. Just add them to the chat and Dr. Landstrom will address those. A wonderful presentation, Dr. Landstrom. So here's one. Will I be able to see my own data during a clinical trial?
It's a superb question. And it might vary a little bit, but oftentimes not necessarily. There a part of the clinical trial which is really important is that oftentimes you may not know whether you're taking the drug, whether you're what arm of the study you're in, especially for some of the later phase clinical trials. And so you may not know. You may not have access to your results from your trial.
Okay, thank you. Let's see. So can you comment on how the dismantling of health research will affect your work as well as the work of others? Thinking about government grants you have, advances with CRISPR, et cetera.
Yeah. I think it is a challenging time for biomedical research, just for a variety of reasons. there are slowdowns right now, mainly on the funding side, particularly federal funding. In terms of what can happen down the road, I think anyone's guess is probably is as good as mine. I think one of the things that needs to remain central as we all move forward is, life-saving therapies need to get into the hands of patients. And so certainly, regardless of what happens in the climate around us, I think we should very much be focusing on those really important discoveries that can lead to clinical trials and move those clinical trials forward. We talked about the timeline for many of these trials being years and years and years. Slowdowns are somewhat inevitable, but I think if we advocate to make sure that the process is safe, but yet the administrative slowdowns are minimized, I think that's probably where we should be. And so my hope is that these will all continue, but we are in a period of uncertainty.
Okay, thank you. Will my test results from the trial be communicated to my medical team?
Another great question. It can vary, but not always will those results be communicated to the medical team, for example. So they're usually conducted sort of in a vacuum, so that only the people who are kind of regulating the trial are seeing those results. So it's a variable thing, but I would not bank on it.
Okay, Jeff asks, when do you think there will be some trials for us? He's an ACM gene negative or elusive folks.
Wonderful question. So gene therapy right now is really targeted to PKP2. So of course you need to know your mutation to know whether you're eligible. There are lots of individuals who know their mutation with arrhythmic cardiomyopathy that may not be PKP2 positive. For example, people may have DSP variants or other components of that cardiac desmosome. Right now, for those individuals, there are no gene therapies, nor are there gene therapies in clinical trials for individuals who don't have a mutation or genotype negative for their arrhythmic cardiomyopathy. That's not to say that there isn't really great things that are in the works, particularly in the small molecule domain. And so my hope would be that there are clinical trials coming up in the next few years that even if they don't take a gene therapy approach to arrhythmic cardiomyopathy, that they take a small molecule approach, like a traditional medicine approach. And my hope is that those trials will be transitioning from the preclinical trial phase to the early trial phase in the next few years, but timeline, I can't be certain.
Okay, thank you. So what goes into the decision to stop a clinical trial and who makes that decision?
Yeah, I mean, it's a balance, right? So the most important function of the FDA and regulatory oversight as trials progress is to protect the safety of the individuals in the trial. Now, you might imagine that what we consider safe changes a little bit. So if it's a life-threatening disease process, we may say, okay, we're going to tolerate a little more in the way of side effects than for other things. And so it's a balance. Oftentimes the FDA and the people who are overseeing these trials are watching actively as the results come in. And there is a phase, or there is a point at which potentially concerns over safety are sufficient enough where they don't think that it is outweighed by the potential benefit of the trial. And so oftentimes that's when the FDA is stepping in. Oftentimes too, the investigators also realize, well, gosh, this didn't quite work out the way that we wanted. And so they're an important player in all of this. Trials can also be ended early because the drug just simply doesn't do what we think it's going to do. It may be safe, but it may not have the beneficial impact, the efficacy that we think. Oftentimes, that just becomes a math question. So as the trial is progressing, they're looking to see how far we've gone and how many people have been treated and are we seeing an effect? And if we're not in the first, say, first chunk of individuals, the first cohort of individuals, there may not be any utility in testing more individuals. So there are lots of reasons why trials can be stopped early. The key is if you're a participant, oftentimes you're not able to kind of see behind the curtain. So from your perspective, it may just seem like the trial just sort of ended, and you may not have a lot of details as to why. It's a very important thing just to know about trials if you participate.
So if I'm part of a clinical trial that ended up being stopped, what does that process look like from my end as a patient?
Yeah, you might be left with a lot of questions as to what the heck just happened. Like I said, you may not be privy to all of the details. Um, the bigger question in my mind, kind of going forward, is what does that mean for me, for future clinical trials, for my treatment of my SADS condition? And again, it all kind of depends on the nature under which the trial ended and what your SADS condition is and the nature of the trial. But there may be a lot of questions there. And I think that I think is something just to keep in mind, particularly for those early phase trials. You're really an explorer. And just like somebody who is trying to sail across the ocean to discover the new world, sometimes you got to just turn back, and it could be for a variety of reasons. And oftentimes you may not have all of those answers. So these are things to discuss, and they're probably going to vary from trial to trial. But these are things to discuss early on if you're thinking about participating.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Landstrom. Are there any other questions? Feel free to put them in the chat. We appreciate you sharing your knowledge and expertise with us tonight. This has been fabulous. So I just want to thank everyone for participating and appreciate you again, Dr. Landstrom.
My pleasure. You'll
Okay.
have a good evening.
Thank you, everyone, and have a good evening.